male and female. So again, this talk is good for those who are questioning this themselves. Who am I? And we all have to grow into our identity. It's one of the challenges of life. It's not easy. For some, it's more difficult than others, but also, again, for those who are guiding the young, whether in our families or in our parishes and schools, faith formation, youth ministry. This talk will be recorded, and then we can push it out to others who cannot be here tonight, people that you know would benefit, who could use this guidance. A very confused world. So very pleased to have Dr. Grabowski with us tonight.
Thank you, Father, and thank you to everyone who got the technology working for us. So thanks be to God. Let's go. Okay. And thank you all for coming and for your patience while we got things sorted out. Father gave you a little bit of background. I guess I'll start with sharing a story. It was the summer of 2015, and I had just finished preparing my classes for the fall at Catholic University, and I went down to our campus to do a little bit of work, and when I went to my faculty mailbox, there was a large white envelope with a marked from the Holy See sitting on top of my faculty mail, and in that packet, on the top, was a letter from that man who's, whoops. Nope.
There it is, yep.
Okay. Oh, just a little delay, okay. Who's on the top right of your screen, Cardinal Lorenzo Baldassarri, who was then the secretary of the Synod of Bishops. And he said, you have been appointed as an auditor or expert for the upcoming 2015 Synod on Family in Rome in October for 3 weeks. And he went on a little bit. The last line of the Cardinal's opening paragraph to me was, "The Holy Father thanks you for accepting this invitation." My first thought was, I thought it was a different group from Italy that made offers that couldn't be refused. That was not a good thought. My second thought was 3 weeks. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do with my courses for 3 weeks? My third thought, finally getting there, I'm a little slow, was I'm going to Rome. And sure enough, a couple months later, I found myself sitting on a plane on a runway waiting to take off for Europe, and the last words which I texted my children and my wife before taking off were the words of Bilbo running down the lane of the Shire, "I'm going on an adventure!" Because that is what it was. It was a chance to see the church work and pray up close. That image on the bottom right of your screen is basically, you're looking down in the aula, the Synod Hall where I sat. So we had the bishops, and then you had the experts and auditors, the witnesses from different parts of the world sitting up in the back. One of the things I noted at the Synod, and by the way, that image in the center bottom of your screen, that's my little group. Half of our time we were in the big General Assembly, half the time we were in these little circuli minores, these little groups. The two gentlemen with their backs to you in this picture are Cardinal Pell, may he rest in peace, who was the relator of our group, and Archbishop Richard Smith, and next to him, Archbishop Joseph Kurtz. Oh, we still haven't gotten there. There we go. Okay. Got it. You know what? Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. That's good to know. Again, I'm a slow learner, but I get there. I had the opportunity to talk to bishops from all over the world, from not just North America and Europe, but Latin America and Africa and Asia. And one of the things I heard over and over again from bishops was, we keep hearing about gender ideology, but we don't know what this is. and we don't know how to respond to this. We need more guidance. And Archbishop Smith, who is pictured on the top left of your screen, when he found out I had written my doctoral dissertation 30 years earlier on gender, he said, "We got to talk." And he took me out to lunch, and for 4 hours over pasta, we talked about gender ideology, where it came from, and he said, I need to know all the books I need to be reading on this, because we need to respond. So that was one of the things that really kind of led me to say, I was praying one day, and I was thinking about actually writing a different book, a book on marriage, and I really felt like the Lord said, no, you need to go back to your dissertation research. It's time to update this and get this out, because this is the time. So that's a little bit of background to the book, which I'm trying to summarize part of in this talk. But before we go there, just some initial terminology and clarification. So if we can go to the next slide. There we are. So the term transgender is, it's an umbrella term. It gets used to describe a lot of different things. Sometimes it's used to describe people with intersex conditions, which I'll say more about in a moment. Sometimes it's used to describe people struggling with gender dysphoria, what used to, I think, more accurately be called gender identity disorder. Or it can also be used to describe people who are influenced by gender ideology, who have had a stable gender identity, who suddenly say, now I'm transgender, or I'm fluid, or I'm non-binary. The clinical name for that is rapid onset gender dysphoria. And we're seeing a huge rise in the number of people affected by so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria. 30 years ago, the primary people showing up at clinics to have what were then called sex change operations were middle-aged men who were unhappy with themselves and their lives, and so decided they would make themselves look like a woman. Today, it's primarily young people, particularly young women, many of whom would show up on the autism spectrum. So these are young people who are already struggling with their identity, who are already feeling unsettled in their skin, and they come across a set of ideas that says, you know what, we can fix all of that. We can make all of that go away. You just have to walk down this path and follow these supposedly easy steps. So if we go to the next slide. So just a refresher for us, and I don't mean to take us back to a high school biology class here, but even on the physical or biological level, sex is a complex and interdependent set of indicators. There are the obvious genital differences between male and female, but there's also a completely different biochemistry at work in male and female bodies, governed by the preponderance of testosterone in men, estrogen in women, which affects mood, which affects personality, which affects physical development and all kinds of other things. There's genetic sex, the fact that every cell of our bodies, other than our gametes, is stamped with the marker of sexual differentiation. Then the interplay of hormonal and genetic sex creates a host of secondary sex characteristics. The differences in body build, bone to muscle ratio, muscle to fat ratio, body hair, all of those other physiological differences between men and women. And then kind of at the frontier of research over the last couple of decades, brain sex. The fact that our brains are actually structured differently and they function differently, which explain a lot of the typical differences in communication pattern and cognitive specialization between men and women. There are some researchers who will say that the most sexually differentiated part of the human body is the brain, although we're just starting to understand that. So bear this in mind when we're talking about gender transitioning, because gender transitioning, it will cosmetically reconfigure the external genitalia and can remove internal gonads. By forcing an ongoing regimen of cross-sex hormones, it can impact a person's biochemistry, although note that a person who fully transitions will have to stay on cross-sex hormones their entire life. because their body is actively resisting the chemical change with which it's being bombarded. And that over time will account for some changes in secondary sex characteristics. There is no change in genetic sex, right? There's no change in the secondary sex characteristics that have already been largely established in puberty or adolescence, in terms of physical size, for example. So I mentioned the term intersex, sometimes called disorders of sexual development. Intersex is another kind of generic term used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit the typical definitions of male or female. The estimates, the UN estimate, which is slightly more conservative than some others, about 0.5% to a little under 2% of the population, the number is probably at the lower end, right? Because some of what gets counted as an intersex condition are just physiological differences. A man who has a smaller than normal penis, a woman who has a larger than normal clitoris can sometimes get counted. Those can get counted as intersex conditions. The actual real hard cases are pretty few. But it's important to note that these are variations in the expression of sexual difference, not exceptions to binary sex. The term intersex literally means between the two sexes, right? So this isn't a third thing. This doesn't, as some activists try to argue, explode the gender binary. We had a student at Catholic University a couple of years ago who wrote her dissertation on intersex in the light of St. John Paul II's theology of the body, which I'll say more about in a little bit. St. John Paul II's idea is that our bodies communicate the reality of who we are as men or women through our maleness and femaleness. The body speaks. The sexually differentiated body speaks. It's a sacrament of the person. In the case of a person with an intersex condition, that speech becomes a whisper. So we have to listen more closely. We have to kind of lean in and hear what the body is saying. But the body can still be understood and read and received as a gift and as the expression of a man or a woman. And then there's gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is usually described as the feeling of discomfort or distress. They're keeping up with me, that's great. That can occur in people whose gender identity differs from their biological sex or sex-related physical characteristics. Someone who feels like they are the wrong sex trapped in a body. Let me acknowledge and state what is both obvious and important. This is a real form of suffering for people who are affected by it, right? It's a real profound suffering to feel like, I'm wrong, I don't fit, there's something wrong with me, my body doesn't match who I feel like I am. But beyond that, anything else I'm going to say and will say about what causes this, how we best describe it, and how we best treat it is contentious, because there are radically different approaches. One approach says this is a psychological issue that should be treated through psychological means. It's a form of body dysmorphic disorder, kind of like having anorexia, where a person has a perception of themselves as grotesquely overweight when in fact they're dangerously thin, right? So that person needs psychological help to accept the reality of their body as it is. They don't need liposuction and appetite suppressants, right? That's the wrong approach to helping someone struggling with the pain of anorexia. That's kind of the more traditional approach to deal with, again, what was more characteristically called gender identity disorder. Now, however, there are some within the medical community and certainly among the kind of the activist community who are arguing that no, someone who experiences gender dysphoria should be encouraged to socially transition, adopt the pronouns and dress of the other sex, then chemically transition with cross-sex hormones, and then, if they opt for it, surgically transition, to have cosmetic procedures to make their bodies look like the other sex. So, with that little bit of background, for some years, the church has been issuing warnings about gender ideology. And this is why I got those questions from bishops at the synod. And if we go to the next slide, probably the clearest articulation of this was by Pope Benedict the 16th in his final Christmas address to the Roman Curia. In a long address, Pope Benedict devoted a section of it to this issue, and to read just a small part. And by the way, I apologize for all the text on the screen. You can see that I failed PowerPoint school, because the first rule of PowerPoint is don't put a lot of text on your slides. I have colleagues who point this out to me, and they're like, you don't have to do that. You could just do bullets. I know. But, so, Pope Benedict said, the famous saying of Simone de Beauvoir, one is not born a woman, one becomes so. On ne naît pas femme, on le devient. These words lay the foundation for what is put forward today under the term gender as a new philosophy of sexuality. According to this philosophy, sex is no longer a given element of nature that man has to accept and personally make sense of. It is a social role that we choose for ourselves, while in the past it was chosen for us by society. People dispute the idea they have a nature given by their bodily identity that serves as a defining element of the human being. They deny their nature and decide that it is not something previously given to them, but they make it for themselves. The words of the creation account, male and female, he created them, no longer apply. So notice a couple of things in Pope Benedict's diagnosis here. As he points out, in existentialist philosophy by the mid-20th century, the idea that gender was a social construct was kind of catching on. De Beauvoir certainly was one of the individuals articulating this at kind of the beginning of what scholars call the second wave of feminism. But today, Benedict says, we're in a different place in the early 21st century, because now gender isn't seen as a social construct that is kind of pushed on people, but a self-chosen identity that we articulate for ourselves. So it's purely an individually articulated reality. It has no relation to our bodies and their physiological expression of sex. We kind of choose who we want to be. The effects of this, if we go to the next slide, are starting to become evident in the world around us, especially here in the United States, because it's interesting, the European Union is kind of backing away and starting to take a real hard look at the negative impact of gender transitioning procedures on people who undergo them. And the data is disturbing, to say the least. But here in the United States, it's kind of full speed ahead, at least at this point. So let's look a little bit at the emerging world of gender ideology. There we are. The first impact of this, this follows logically from Pope Benedict's words, that there aren't two genders, there aren't 4 or 5, there are dozens and dozens and perhaps hundreds, according to some people. The United Nations is currently debating a treaty which would recognize over 100 different genders and make it a human rights violation to fail to do so. Facebook has over 70 gender options for its users, and if one of those doesn't fit you, you can build your own, right? So this is our brave new world of self-created gender identity. And then there's the impact on medicine. If we go to the next slide, there we are. As I alluded to, people promoting gender ideology will argue what we need to do is for children who show gender discordance even as young as 3, we need to allow them to socially transition, to use the pronouns and dress of the other sex, and then while still in primary school, we need to get them on puberty blockers to delay the onset of adolescence. And by the way, that's an off-label use of the drug. And we're just starting to learn some of the harmful effects, like loss of bone density, problems growing, other physiological problems that are starting to manifest themselves in children who have been put on puberty blockers at a very early age. And then when they get to adolescence, cross-sex hormones. So their bodies will start to develop secondary sex characteristics of the other sex. And then as early as legally possible, they should be encouraged to do surgical transitioning. And we have medical clinics in California which are performing double mastectomies on 12-year-old girls with healthy breasts. We have doctors in facilities in California and elsewhere performing castrations on 15-year-old boys, so-called bottom surgeries, right? So we're not even waiting till adulthood when people can make maybe a slightly more informed decision. And by the way, this is in spite of the fact that every study that's been done has found that over 90% of gender discordant children, that gender discordance will resolve in adulthood even if left untreated. So why are we medicalizing this and pursuing these really radical procedures? And then think about the fact that a number of studies have found that people who struggle with the pain of gender dysphoria and fully transition are still struggling with those same psychological problems and pain. The rate of suicide among people who have fully transitioned is 19 times higher than the general population. So how on earth is that good medicine? How is that a good patient-based outcome for medicine? Even before someone has surgical modification of their bodies to remove gonads and reconfigure external genitalia, being on cross-sex hormones for a year or more will typically destroy human fertility. So even if a person were to fully transition and then, as some people have opted to do, try to transition back, detransition, their fertility is gone, right? A person might begin to look like a member of the opposite sex. They will never bear children as a member of the opposite sex. So we need to count the cost of the human and medical cost of what we're recommending to people. This is really brought home if you listen to stories of people who have detransitioned. I don't know if you knew it, but March 12th, we'll celebrate Detransitioner Awareness Day. It doesn't get as much press as some of the other new holidays that we observe, but it's really worth listening to some of those stories. They're heartbreaking, about people who were pushed down this path without really being told what they were signing up for, only to find themselves with their bodies irreparably changed and their psychological pain untouched. That's hardly fair, and it's not good medicine. And then if we go to the next slide, then we have educational programs like the Purple Unicorn, the Gender Unicorn, developed in many and used in many public schools, which teaches children, in the name of not bullying children who are gender discordant in some way, that gender identity is really a complex conjunction of gender identity, gender expression, your sex assigned at birth, which really isn't all that important, who you're physically attracted to, who you're emotionally attracted to. You put all that grid together, and that's where you start to get dozens and dozens of gender options, right? You've probably heard about the drag queen story time in local libraries, where men dressed in drag come in and read stories to children, again, ostensibly to encourage them not to bully or be mean to gender discordant peers. That's a good thing. But if you actually listen to the stories, and if you go on the group's website, Drag Queen Storytime's website, what they tell you is, no, what we really want to do is to encourage children to understand their gender identity as self-chosen and fluid, and explore queer expressions of gender and sex. That's not such a good or wholesome aim. And then we have Disney. Well, we don't talk about Disney, but you've probably read. If we go to the next slide, and then think of what's going on with our language. We have whole new sets of pronouns being invented, and people insisting that these pronouns be used. In certain jurisdictions in the United States, misgendering is a crime. If you intentionally misgender someone in New York City, it can cost you $50,000. If you intentionally misgender someone in California, you could be facing jail time, although that law is currently being challenged in court. People who speak up, people who have gone through the transitioning process and realized it didn't help them and have tried to detransition, are the most silenced group in our society. They are usually attacked. They are canceled, to use our new term for this. And people who break with this new gender orthodoxy are canceled very quickly. We have a few copies of my book available that'll be available after the talk. The day my book came out, Tan, my publisher, went to Facebook to buy advertising for it, and Facebook banned the advertising. We have not been able to do any advertising on any tech platform because it challenges the narrative, and we can't have that. So it's not unlike the ancient Tower of Babel, right? We try to, as Pope Benedict says, we try to play God and say we don't have a human nature, our bodies don't matter, and all we do is confuse ourselves and our language. If we go to the next slide, and you are all aware of, and this has started to get some people's attention, and this is good, that allowing men, biological men who identify as transgender women to compete in women's sports will destroy women's sports within a very short while. The person now known as Leah Thomas, when Leah Thomas in college swam as a male swimmer, he was ranked 462nd in the country in his event. When Leah Thomas was on chemical cross-sex hormones for a year and allowed to swim as a female swimmer, Leah Thomas took first, won an NCAA event, and is the fastest woman in the country in that event. Leah Thomas still has the physical frame of Michael Phelps in terms of body size and wingspan. How is that fair competition for the women who are in that sport? It's obviously not, right? We can't eradicate biology. And all of our chemical and surgical medical procedures don't eradicate biology. Women are increasingly subjected to sharing restrooms and locker room facilities with men who identify as trans women. We have male inmates coming out as transgender women being transferred into women's correctional facilities and impregnating women in those facilities. That's happened in a number of prisons around the country. Again, common sense seems altogether uncommon in terms of the thinking about this. And then if we go to the next slide, where does all this come from? Pope Benedict already pointed us to existentialist thought, right? Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir deny that there is such thing as a human nature. Why? Because they deny the existence of God. Sartre said there's no human nature because there's no God who could have invented it. So therefore we have to define the meaning of our own existence as best we can. Postmodern thought denies that there's any kind of place to stand to arrive at anything like objective truth, whether philosophical or scientific. Truth is a construct. So therefore, not just gender, but sex becomes a construct. Judith Butler, postmodern feminist philosopher, argues that sex is just as constructed as gender. In fact, there's no difference. They're both different kinds of performance that we make, and they have no real connection to our embodied selves. Marxist thought, of course, plays a role here because Marx very famously, Marx and Engels in their work together, called for the abolition of the family because the family was an instrument of oppression. It was an instrument to kind of keep the working classes in their servitude. So abolish the family and we can bring about the proletariat revolution. And if you abolish sexual difference, you have effectively abolished the family. Shulamith Firestone, a Marxist thinker, feminist, who in 1970 wrote a book called The Dialectic of Sex, in which she argued women would be socially, economically, and politically equal to men when all reproduction took place in a laboratory. In other words, when women stopped getting pregnant and bearing children, then they could be equal to men. Again, using technology to eradicate sexual difference, kind of the program of recommended in a slightly different way by gender ideology. And then we have John Money. I mentioned that the separation of gender and sex kind of takes root philosophically in mid-20th century. It also finds its way into the medical community at about the same time. Money was a psychologist and supposedly a sexologist from New Zealand who taught and worked for many years, ran a gender clinic at Johns Hopkins University hospitals here in this area. And Hopkins had one of the largest sex change, again, now we call them gender transitioning programs in the country, until Paul McHugh, who was head of psychology at Hopkins, shut down the program because he said, this is bad medicine. We are harming people. There's no demonstrable help given to people by these procedures. But for many years, Money was the guy running Hopkins. By the way, Hopkins has restarted its program. McHugh retired, and they've got a lot of pressure from activists. So they're doing gender transitioning again. But Money suggested that gender is just something we can kind of impose. So there was his most famous case, the Reimer twins. One boy was the victim of a botched circumcision. And so the parents brought their children to Money, their two twin boys, and Money said, not a problem, we'll just raise this one as a girl. So he did years of, quote, therapy with these boys, having them role play different aspects of being a boy and a girl, including sexually abusing one another. Money was a pedophile, it seems. He should have been in prison, not running a program at Hopkins. But David Reimer's, the boy who his parents tried to raise, with Money's advice, tried to raise as a girl, eventually rejected that imposed identity, tried to go back to being a male, but unfortunately ended up committing suicide in adulthood because of the psychological trauma to which he was subjected, a lot of it at the hands of people who were ostensibly, supposedly helping him. So Money was, the man was a criminal, to put it lightly, but his work is still widely cited by proponents of gender ideology and gender theory as kind of the medical pioneer. It's rather shocking. And then if we go to the next slide. So all of these kind of currents of modern thought get spilled out into our culture by some massive kind of social and historical shifts that we've undergone in the last couple of centuries. The first of these, the Industrial Revolution, and all of these we're still feeling the effects of, right? The Industrial Revolution obviously did some good because it made a whole host of things that were too expensive for poor and working class families affordable, but enormously destructive to land and to labor, especially families. Because first, the Industrial Revolution took men out of their families so that women were left to raise children. And for poor and working class families, a lot of times women were forced into the workforce as well. So children were left basically untended, unsupervised, unless they were working on the streets as well, trying to help support their families. So, but then the deeper and more lasting impact of the Industrial Revolution, when you outsource work from the home, it changes the way you think about children, because within the space of a generation or two, the view of children shifted from being a blessing, which is the biblical view, to a burden. Because every child born within the family is another mouth to feed. That lights a fire under the search for more effective forms of contraception. And if we go to the next slide, which brings us to the sexual revolution, which actually began in the 19th century, but got put on jet fuel or steroids, pick your chemical analogy, in the mid-20th century with the advent of oral contraception, which unleashed a huge shift in attitudes and behaviors. What had been a single reality, marriage, sex, family, You got married, you entered into a sexual relationship with your spouse that enabled you to receive the gift of children, now became three separate dissociable moving parts. Because contraception promised you can have sex without having to worry about pregnancy, so having to commit to marriage. You can get married and have an intentionally childless marriage. And now with assisted reproductive technologies, you can have children without either being married or having sex. So what was one thing, now three less and less related things. And massive impact on individuals, on families. Mary Eberstadt has really chronicled this in her work, Adam and Eve After the Pill, and her more recent book, Primal Screams. Eberstadt's recent book is really interesting. She argues that the question of our time, especially among young people, is who am I? Because the sexual revolution has caused so much pain and suffering among families through divorce, through abortion, through child neglect, through sex outside of marriage. It's caused so much chaos. People no longer get their sense of belonging from their families. So they look for it somewhere else. And they find a group or a tribe to identify with. And then that's where they get their belonging and hence their identity. And so if you try to engage in political discussion and you criticize this group, it's taken not as a political disagreement, but a personal attack, which is one reason why our politics is so toxic and so full of rage, because people don't know where they belong. They don't get their sense of belonging from family and church anymore. And then we have the technology revolution, still going on. We're living it. We experienced a little bit of it at the beginning of this talk tonight when we couldn't quite get it off the ground, but thanks be to God. But we spend more and more of our lives with these things, right? With screens, with technology, and again, there's good aspects to that, right? We could have people on the other side of the world present here listening with us, right? And yet, you also have the images like the one in the middle of that slide with the family around the table and everyone's on their own device, right? No one's interacting with each other, the person next to them. Pope Francis says that's not a family, that's a boarding house. And he's right. More to the point of what we're talking about here, though, is spending time in our digital worlds creates the idea in people's minds that our bodies are just another screen. So we can change our screen identity. We can change avatars. We can change how we present ourselves to people in a digital world. Well, why not do that in real life, too? If I'm not happy with what I'm projecting, I'll make my body project what I want it to project. This, in its own way, feeds into gender ideology and the idea of gender fluidity. The deepest and most ancient core of gender ideology, I would argue, is the oldest heresy in the history of the church, Gnosticism. The one heresy that we see sprouting up throughout the church's history over and over again, even in the pages of the New Testament. The first letter of John, which we're reading in the liturgy right now, says, "Who is the Antichrist? Those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ come in the flesh." Ancient Gnostics believed that the body and the material world were evil. They were the work of an evil creator God. And the good God was the God of light and of spirit and of energy. And you had to follow the right diet, high in light and energy, and get the secret teaching that only the Gnostic teachers could give you, which would enable you to ascend out of this corrupt material world and the little spark of your spirit ascend back up into heaven. If you've ever encountered New Age philosophy or ideas, it's 20th century Gnosticism, right? Gender ideology is 21st century Gnosticism. It also sees the body as a problem to be overcome, something to be escaped from. Your sex assigned at birth has no meaning. It's it's the identity you choose for yourself. Whereas Christian faith says our bodies are central to who we are. The Son of God in the incarnation took on a body, took on a human body just like ours, suffered, died, and was raised to the heavens in that human body. It's that glorified flesh that we taste every time we receive the Eucharist, right? So Tertullian's phrase, caro salutis cardo, the flesh is the hinge of salvation. That's the Christian belief. Our bodies are not evil. The material world is not evil. Any account of Christian spirituality that says the body is something that has to be overcome or destroyed is not Christian. It's tainted with Gnosticism in some way. Pope Francis gives a long warning about contemporary Gnosticism in Gaudete et Exultate, his document on the call to holiness. So where do we go to offer an alternative? Obviously, we look to Scripture. We also have this great gift of a biblical anthropology, commentary on Scripture, given to us by St. John Paul II, called the Theology of the Body. And people have pointed out that the Theology of the Body was written precisely to respond to the challenges of the Industrial Revolution, the sexual revolution, and our ongoing technology revolution. So what does Scripture tell us? It tells us that God made the Adam, the human, in his image. In his own image, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Being male and female is part of the way in which we image God. Being male and female is how we respond to God's first command given to humanity in the pages of Scripture, which is simultaneously a blessing. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and be many. Fill the earth, subdue it." That capacity to give new life, to bring new life in the image of God into the world is inextricably tied to our sexually differentiated bodies, the gift of being man and woman. In the second story of creation in Genesis 2, God says, "It is not good for the Adam to be alone. I will make a helper who corresponds to him." And God casts this deep sleep on our first parent, our first father, and while he's sleeping, he takes from his side a rib and builds it into a woman, leads her to the man, and then he, seeing her, responds with this little poem of joy. "This one at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, Isha, because out of man, Ish, she's been taken." So Ish, Isha, these are relational terms. St. John Paul II says, this is the spousal meaning of the body. The man recognizes the meaning of his body when he meets woman. She recognizes the meaning of her body when she meets man. Our sexually differentiated bodies only make sense in light of one another because they enable us to make a gift of ourselves to one another. In whatever state in life God calls us, by the way, marriage, single life, consecrated life, or celibacy, we enter into the Christian life and make a gift of ourselves as a man or a woman. That's our fundamental call. St. John Paul II is very clear that the man and the woman, I keep losing the fact that we're not connected, but they're keeping up. So they're doing whatever we're paying them, we should double it. I just want to say that, Father. So their unity, St. John Paul II, commenting on this story of creation, says, that is the unity of our first parents, unity denotes above all the identity of human nature. Duality, on the other hand, shows what on the basis of this identity constitutes the masculinity, femininity of created man. So there's one human nature. Men and women are equally and fully human. One sex is not more human than the other. But there are two irreducibly different ways of existing as a person, as being an embodied person. That is male and female, right? So our sexually differentiated bodies are a gift. And the gift is complementary. When you put those two together, there's a synergy. They have an ability to create more together than they can apart. Bearing children is one of the most unique and precious aspects of this, but it's true across the board. Men and women, if we go to the next slide, are complementary not just physically, not just physiologically in our reproductive capacity. We are complementary in every dimension of our personhood. John Paul says, not only from the physical and psychological points of view, but also from the ontological. In our very being, we are complementary to each other. So we can speak of the Holy See in its position paper for the Women's Conference in Beijing, which John Paul II either authored or approved, said we can speak of biological, individual, personal, and spiritual complementarity. So men and women and their unique gifts, their unique skill sets, complement on all these levels of our existence, which is why we need the gifts of men alongside the gifts of women in the home. And we need the genius of women alongside those of men in public life, in society, and in the church, right? Because our gifts are complementary. And this idea of complementarity is not that of the Greek philosopher Plato, right? Like a man is a half a person and a woman's a half a person, so you got to put them together and then you get a whole human. No. It's not 1/2 + 1/2 = 1. It's 1 + 1 = 1+. Man and woman in coming together form a new kind of unity, a synergistic unity together. One more important piece here, and this is given to us by Pope Francis. After summarizing the challenges that gender ideology poses to the family, much like Pope Benedict did in his Christmas address in 2012, Pope Francis makes one other really important distinction, and it's highlighted on that slide. He says it needs to be emphasized that biological sex and the socio-cultural role of sex, or gender, can be distinguished but not separated. There's the key, right? Of course, it is true that different cultures, different points in history understand what it means to live as a man or a woman differently, right? There are different assumptions about that in 21st century America than in 17th century China or 14th century India, right? Different times, even different cultures today have different associations with what it means to be a man or a woman. But what we have to recognize is if we want to call that gender, right, those different kind of traits or roles that people tend to inhabit and express themselves in, that has to be rooted in our physical embodied sex, right? So distinguished but not separated. That's key. So let me try to put these pieces together. And this is going to be a very quick sketch, but so as I said, what the church and what Scripture tells us is that there is one human nature, right? So on the level of our human nature, sexual difference is an accident, right? It's something that human nature can exist without. Whereas on the level of individually actually existing persons, sexual difference is an essential or an intrinsic quality, right? Every human individual is either male or female. There's no exception. Again, even a person with an intersex condition, their body might not as clearly express that reality, but they are still male or female. Even on a biological level, we can still discern that. So Aristotle, who's much maligned at times in terms of his biology, but he makes a useful analogy here. He says, it belongs to the nature of numbers as a whole that they be either odd or even. So in terms of numbers as a whole, oddness or evenness is an accidental quality because we can find other numbers that don't have that particular quality. But on the level of any existing actual number, oddness or evenness is an essential quality. So if I take 2 and I make it odd, it's no longer 2. If I take 3 and make it even, it's no longer 3. If there were a medical procedure that could make a man a woman or a woman a man, and we do not have that, and I don't think we ever will, then what we would be doing is changing the very identity of the person. But again, that's not what gender transitioning does. It's a cosmetic reconfiguration of the body. So we can distinguish between, I would say, deeper qualities that are rooted in our embodied personhood, like vocations. Only a man can be a husband and a father. Only a woman can be a wife and a mother. And by the way, every man and every woman, as they mature, is called to motherhood or fatherhood, be that physical or spiritual or both. We're called to be generative. We're called to be life-giving. And each sex has its own distinctive gifts or genius, right? The genius of men, the genius of women that Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis often speak about. But then we can also speak about specific roles, which are more cultural and historical constructs or familial assumptions. And some of those roles have changed over time and can continue to change. Those are not as deeply rooted in the person. But again, note, being a husband or a wife or a mother or a father, those are not roles. Those are vocations in which we realize the call to holiness that we're given in baptism. So if you want to dig deeper into this topic, some resources that I would recommend. If you want a good look at the science here that I've been alluding to, Paul McHugh and Lawrence Meyer produced a study together. Again, McHugh was the one who shut down the gender transitioning program at Hopkins some years ago until it got restarted after his retirement. The New Atlantis report will give you a really thorough look at the psychological and biological research that says gender ideology just gets this wrong in so many ways. If you want a really good dive into the public policy dimensions of this, Ryan Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, which used to be sold on Amazon until Amazon pulled it and stopped selling it right when the Equality Act was introduced into the US House of Representatives. Coincidence? Probably not. Abigail Favale has a recent book with Ignatius Press, The Genesis of Gender, and Abigail is terrific. She was raised an evangelical, became kind of a postmodern feminist, so kind of knows gender theory from the inside, and then had a conversion and is now a Catholic author and thinker. Very good book. And then, as I mentioned, Unraveling Gender, which, by the way, my publisher won't sell on Amazon because they're afraid Amazon's going to do the same thing to it, but it sometimes pops up there from third-party sellers. But you can get it from Tan Books. That's the best place to get it if you don't get one tonight. So in concluding, some kind of takeaway points. We have to affirm, because this is what Scripture and the Church gives us, the world which we have is a gift, right? Creation is a gift, and we're not the authors of it. God is. Every human being is made in the image and likeness of God, including people who have an intersex condition, or people who struggle with gender dysphoria and identify as transgender, or people who experience same-sex attraction. No human being has less dignity or value or is less loved by God. The body and its sexually differentiated expression is a gift. It's not a screen that we can change the view if we don't like it. It is a gift, and it is an integral part of who we are as persons. John Paul II, over and over again in the Theology of the Body, tells us the body expresses the person. So our bodies aren't a screen, they're a window. They invite others to encounter the depth of who we are as persons, especially as we learn to give ourselves in love. Every person is called to the vocation of love. In fact, that's the only thing that ultimately fulfills us. The Second Vatican Council's Pastoral Constitution on the Church, Gaudium et Spes, a text that St. John Paul II loved, to quote from section 24, "Man, the only creature of the visible world whom God created for his own sake, can only realize himself through the sincere gift of self." We're created for love. We're created for communion with others. So our bodies are not a screen on which to project an identity. We could also, in addition to thinking of our bodies as a window, we could say our bodies are like a compass that point us toward our origin, which is love, the love of God, the love of our parents, and our destiny, which is love, right? But to use that compass and navigate by it well, we need the map that is given to us by revelation, by Scripture and tradition, and the teaching of the Church. I do want to note, in my day job, I'm a moral theologian, that notice I'm not criticizing the technologies per se, right? Hormonal therapy can have uses. surgical intervention, like for a person who has an intersex condition and as an adult decides, I want to have some medical treatment to let my body more clearly express the reality, the genetic reality of my sex, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Those kind of technologies can be helpful, can be useful in helping to clarify the body's expression of sex as opposed to trying to rewrite it. So it's not the technology that's good or bad, it's the end for which it's used. And then finally, I think this is an important pastoral note to end on. When it comes to gender ideology, I've argued gender ideology, rightly understood, is a heresy, right? It is at odds with the Christian doctrine of creation, the Christian understanding of the body, and the gift of sexual differentiation within the body. Therefore, gender ideology as a set of ideas has to be defeated. We have to, and it can be defeated on both philosophical and scientific grounds. Has a really bad reading of science and medical data, especially if we're looking at patient-based outcomes. But we're not fighting against people who are struggling with their gender identity. We're not even fighting against activists who promote gender ideology, right? Those are individuals who are loved by God, who are called into communion with God. We're fighting against these destructive ideas and their spiritual roots, which are ultimately demonic. Cardinal Sarah says gender ideology is a Luciferian deception. Cardinal Sarah is absolutely right. Right? This is a confusion that's been sown by the enemy in our own time, in our world, and it's trying to creep into the church in different ways. So that's our real opponents. The battle we're in is a spiritual battle with spiritual roots. People who are impacted by gender ideology, we're called to love them. We're called to reach out to them in love, right? So we don't take the teaching of the church and, as Pope Francis says, turn it into dead stones to hurl at people. And by the way, if you probably know people who have been impacted by gender ideology, and you've probably found from your own experience that throwing truth bombs at them, whether those truth bombs come from church teaching or from science, doesn't go very far, right? Especially if they've kind of really drunk deeply at the well of these ideas. Those people need what Pope Francis calls accompaniment. They need people to encounter them, befriend them, walk with them, listen to them, but also help steer them toward the truth, right? When I was at the 2015 Synod, I heard accompaniment was one of the buzzwords. Everywhere you went, accompaniment. I got back from the Synod and one of our graduate students came and said, we're having a speaker to campus. Would you accompany us to dinner? And I said, no, but I'll go with you. Just please don't use that word. Sorry, yeah, I've gotten over it. It's fine. I'm better now. But it's the right word here, right? We need to walk with these people. But the image that we talked about a lot at the Synod was the model of accompaniment is Jesus with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Jesus encounters these disciples, he listens to them, he listens to their concerns, but then he challenges them. So how slow you are to believe the scriptures. Didn't the Christ have to undergo all of this? So accompaniment doesn't mean we're walking nowhere with a person. Accompaniment means we are walking next to this person to lead them to Christ, who is the great physician, who's the one who can actually treat their pain. And yes, they might need psychological intervention too, and with a good therapist, and that's fine. But ultimately, the wounds that cause things like an unstable gender identity, they need the Lord's healing touch, right? So when we accompany people who are struggling with gender discordance, we're accompanying them toward the Lord. We're not just walking nowhere. So we need to welcome. Pope Francis says the church is a field hospital. The family ought to be the nearest hospital. So we need to welcome people into the field hospital so they can be treated by Christ, the great physician, with the medicine of mercy and the sacraments, right? That's our goal. So this is part of the new. This is one of the challenges of the new evangelization, is reaching out to, ministering to people, evangelizing people who are struggling with the pain of gender discordance. So that's our task. I'll end with this. What we really need to do is to, as the church tells us, we need to evangelize the culture in which we live. The root of the word culture is the Latin cultus, which one of its meanings is to worship. If you want to change a culture, change what it worships, right? We need to change our technology-obsessed, production-obsessed, image-obsessed culture to a culture built around the author of life and of love. And then people can, with all of our pain and suffering and wounds, people can begin to find healing within the church, within our families, within our communities. So thank you all for your patient attention. Thank you to the, there's one more slide. My display doesn't match their display. So my postscript. The church, when you bring your children or grandchildren to the church for baptism, the church prays and says, you are the first teachers of your children in the ways of the faith. May you be the best of teachers, right? So it's our job as parents, as grandparents, as uncles, as aunts, to teach, to help to form our children. There was a study done last year that school-age children in two-parent homes, so both mother and father in the home, on average spend 30 minutes a week in one-on-one interaction with their father. That same child spends 30 hours per week online, on social media, consuming videos, music. So who's really forming that child? So we all have work to do, especially the men. Men need to re-engage, I think, and we can make a difference on this issue. So again, thank you.
I'd like to open it up to about 15 minutes of question and answer, just some comments. Doctor covered a lot, so we got a lot of good information to bring with us, but if you would like to clarify a point or get some clarification on a question, we'll open it up for just 15 minutes. Yeah. So it's 8:30 now, so 8:45. But if you want to ask questions, stand up and then speak it loudly and then ask the doctor to repeat the question. Great question. So the question is, someone working in faith formation with high school students, how much of these issues should you aim to broach in that setting because you don't want to give scandal to children? On the other hand, children are probably exposed, more exposed to gender ideology than most of us realize. I think my suggestion for people working in faith formation with high school, middle school children, I would suggest start by partnering with parents, right? Get as much as you can, get your parents involved, get them, and work together with them. But I think you really should assume that the kids you're working with in faith formation are hearing this in the culture. Right? Because it's in the music, it's in their video entertainment. It's certainly in the online worlds where they spend a lot of their time. And again, online chat rooms and groups
are where a lot of people first stumble across this set of ideas and then start to get kind of hooked by it. So I would not wait till they raise the questions. I would assume they're hearing some of it, but before you just start throwing out information, I would try to get a sense from the parents and get them working with you to help form these kids in what's the church's vision of our bodies? What's the church's vision of what it means to be male and female? And how is that all, in fact, confirmed and corroborated by what science and medicine can tell us? So, yeah, I would assume that it's something they're being bombarded with probably daily. Great question, though. Thank you. Yes, in the back. Yeah. So a great point. So the question, I don't know if I'm going to be able to fully do justice to it, but I'll try. A presentation given to school-age children from a speaker saying that if a child identifies as transgender, we should use their preferred pronouns and refer to them accordingly. Otherwise, it increases the suicide risk of that child by up to 65%. And how do we deal with that kind of a claim, that kind of information? Is that fair? So, first of all, I would just say that you hear that kind of point made a lot, but the evidence doesn't support it. Because as I said, to date, the most thorough, comprehensive academic study that's been done on this has found that actually the suicide rate spikes exponentially for people who have walked down the path of transitioning. But a lot of times this is kind of a scare tactic used by some activists to say, well, if you don't let this child move forward, he or she is going to kill themselves, harm themselves. Again, it's not actually what the data shows. So it's a kind of a specious argument. So I would push back when you hear people making this argument. The issue of pronouns is an important issue. I teach at a university, and I have had students who teach at other Catholic colleges and universities reach out to me on this question and say, I have people who identify as transgender coming in my classes, and they want to be addressed in this way. What do I do? My answer to them and my own kind of policy here is, in general, I will use whatever name a person prefers to be called because, some people prefer nicknames. There are some names that can apply equally to both genders. My wife is Claire. She's named after her grandfather, who was Saint Clair. Right? So, yeah, I don't have any problem with the name, and I will use anyone's preferred form of a name. I will not use pronouns that obviously do not fit the physiological or biological reality of the person in front of me, because charity as Pope Benedict reminded us so beautifully, always has to be rooted in truth, right? And if I am using pronouns that describe a person in a way that contradicts the obvious reality of their bodies, I am participating in a falsehood, and I'm actually harming that person. I'm not being charitable toward that person. So I will not do that. And if I get in a situation, some people have said, well, I'm at a work situation and they want us to list our preferred pronouns. I would say, if that's what your office does, if you're able to, just say I'm a conscientious objector. I don't do that. I'll be respectful and of any person I interact with, but I will not participate in this linguistic form of unreality. Because words matter. Words either truthfully reflect reality or they distort it. I think the forced pronoun usage is a line too far, and I would object both on legal and on moral grounds and not participate. Way in the back. So you're going to have to use your most outside voice. No. So the question is, did gender ideology have its origins in academia? I would say academia is one of the engines that has spread this, and then the further dimension to that question was the relationship to same-sex attraction. And I don't deny that the issues are interconnected in some important ways, even psychologically. Right? Gender identity and sexual attraction interact in some definite and complicated ways. We have some understanding of that, not entirely so. Certainly in our identity politics, they get bundled together. It's all part of the LGBTQ plus coalition. But I do think there are ways in which the issues are distinct. Another way in which I guess you could say that they are related is even before Obergefell, the Supreme Court ruling legalizing same-sex marriage back in, was it 2015, I think? The activists who were pushing for same-sex marriage and helped power this through the courts were already turning their attention to gender and transgender issues. So yeah, there's a common political push, and I don't deny that a lot of that comes from people in academia, people in the media, other people who are politically. So I think people, for political ends, will bundle these issues together, even though I will say I have encountered people who would identify as same-sex attracted who think medicalizing self-harm of children is absolutely horrific, or allowing men to compete, biological men to compete in women's sports is completely unjust. So there are actually some people who would identify as same-sex attracted or would describe themselves as same-sex attracted, who would, I think, support pushing back on this issue. And then would probably be labeled transphobic as a result. But yes, sir.
Okay, last question.
Last question.
Yeah, back on the truth focus, it seems like, in my lifetime, when I was in elementary school, they would ask us what our sex was, we would put male or female. I guess And it was kind of a polite thing, but it seems like, the cat's out of the bag. Should we just stop? I mean, what is gender? It seems made up. And, it seems like it's gotten associated with this label like sex or, country of origin, these truths, I guess.
Yeah.
Should we stop participating in what's your gender?
Yeah.
I mean, is that just something we should stop?
So, great question. The question is, gender just used to be a polite synonym for sex because you didn't say sex in polite company, and now suddenly it's gotten all these new and fraught meanings associated with it. So should we stop using it? I was at a panel discussion at the Heritage Foundation in DC, and people who work on Capitol Hill raised that exact question. And Abigail Favale and I were both at this panel, and I mean, we both agreed. Abigail made the point first, I completely agree with her. In a public policy setting, like when we're crafting laws, we should just avoid the word gender. It has too much baggage, it is not useful. Let's stick to sex. Now the activists are gonna try to undermine that too, probably, but it's a lot easier to argue about how we understand sex than it is to argue about how we understand gender, especially in light of all of this. So there are definitely contexts where I think avoiding the term gender altogether is the right approach. Pardon? Good question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But I think there are some bishops who would see the wisdom of that. I really do. Again, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your patience. We have a limited number of books in the back and also some flyers, and not just the gender book. My wife and I have a marriage formation text and a book on raising Catholic kids. So you can check out that table that has the really beautiful woman selling books to you in the very back, and she'll help you out. So, Father, thank you again.
So much. We're so glad to have good people on the front lines, giving very clear thinking on these issues, helping us to understand who we are. I really do encourage you. This will be sent out by flock note to the parish in the next couple days. Do forward that out, right? Forward out to your brothers and sisters, to your parents, to your children, to your grandchildren. Do your part. This doctor came here to do his part. Now let's do our part to promulgate it out, okay? So thank you so much, Doctor, for your witness. It worked.